we are in the Windsor office today at Eton Bridge Partners, and this is our second podcast, so I'm super excited, and it's so important that we talk about this today. The first one we talked about was all about imposter syndrome, and I know you've been doing some fantastic coaching work over the last 6 months, but today we're here to talk about perfectionism. Do you want to give a bit of an intro? And it'd be really good to actually hear about what you've been doing over the last 6 months since we last had that podcast too.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. Very, very happy to be here. And I've been excited about following up on our last one. So I'm Cecilie Nielsen, and I'm an executive coach, a leadership coach. I run a small coaching practice called CN8, and I work with a lot of senior women, professional women, in helping them overcome some of the, I call them traps and coping mechanisms that a lot of us seem to fall into. And that's really what I've been up to. I've been traveling quite a lot. I've got clients all over the world, from Africa to Norway, which is super exciting. And I've just been working with a lot of phenomenal people and helping them step into their best selves and their full potential.
Good. So today we're here to talk about perfectionism. So it'd be really good to kind of, I suppose, identify what that actually means, and I suppose why you want to talk about it and why you talk about it with your clients.
Yeah, so last time we spoke about imposter syndrome, and we said today we tackle perfectionism, and they're both part of the 4 traps that I see women falling into a lot. They're coping mechanisms. They're sort of ways that we behave in order to create safety, but it ends up having the opposite effect. Now, the 4 are imposter syndrome, perfectionism, people pleasing, and validation. And what happens when we go there, we end up questioning 3 really important things: our own ability, our own authority, and our own worth. And so that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about this, and that's why it's important.
Okay. And this resonates a lot actually with me, because after the first podcast, it was the first one I'd ever done. We actually did it on video, and I phoned you that day, and when it was released to the World Wide Web, and I couldn't watch it, and I was quite nervous about it, and I was just I was thinking about what I looked like, how I sounded, what people would think about me, and I didn't understand why, because I really enjoyed doing it, I knew it was really important, and I had nothing to worry about.
But the truth is, you probably had something to worry about, and we should talk about this. I'm so glad you went there, because I felt the same way, right? I was nervous, but I wasn't nervous about the content. I wasn't nervous about the message. I was nervous about how I looked and how I came across, and whether my hair looked okay. And then I was really irritated with myself for being nervous about it, because obviously it was about the message, and it was about feminism, and yet it took me 30 seconds from we stopped recording to start worrying about whether I was likable enough to get my point across. And at the risk of generalizing, I just very much doubt that our male colleagues have this direct association between whether their hair looks okay and whether they'll be taken seriously, right? But there's a reason this happens for us as women. This whole, do I fit in with the feminine ideal enough to be accepted, to be liked?
And is that just part of our DNA, our makeup as a female? Or is that from, history and society, and how obviously we've had to kind of grow up?
So I want to talk about the specific dynamic for women. I think before we go there, let's talk about some of the things that happen to us as human beings, because that's sort of the overall context. And it's a little bit of neuroscience and sort of evolutionary biology. We just hang in there. So, that when we were hunter-gatherers, if you got rejected from the group, you wouldn't survive, right? You're on your own on the savannah, you get eaten by a lion, end up. And so rejection equals death. And the part of our brain that looks after that looks after our survival hasn't necessarily updated that much since then. There are other parts that are super advanced now, like your prefrontal cortex, but that part isn't, and it still sits there watching out for danger and threats to your survival, like rejection. So that part wants you to fit in, It
Okay.
wants you to belong. It wants you to be liked because then you'll be safe.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so that's just human condition. But then when you take it one step further and think about for women, you've got things like, if you think about the history, right? A couple of years, 100 years ago, we didn't have authority. We didn't have financial authority. We didn't have sovereignty. We had to rely on other people to choose us and to protect us and to keep it safe. And in order for that to happen, we had to be liked and chosen. And so you sort of got a double whammy there if you're a woman. So there's that, but it gets worse. So if you look at, I know, if you look at
Really?
some, yes, unfortunately, there's some pretty recent and quite prominent research that Brene Brown, which we'll get to her, quotes in one of her books, which is that if you look at the cultural expectations of a cisgender woman in Western society, the top 3 attributes are thin, nice, and modest. Right? Pause for reaction. so you can imagine when you and I then go and do something like, like this, we stick our necks out, we're talking about feminism, your brain is like, wait, this feels really unsafe. And it goes to, how do we protect ourselves? Well, by living up to the ideal so that you don't get rejected, right? Am I thin enough? Am I nice enough? Am I modest enough? Am I likable enough? Am I pretty enough? Does that make sense? And
Yeah.
it's an awful thing to have to admit in 2022 as independent, I think pretty smart, capable, resourceful women. But there are reasons our brains go there, and I don't think we talk about it enough, partly because I guess it's a little bit shameful, right? We don't want to feel this way, but it happens. And from my knowledge and working with lots and lots of clients, it happens to almost all of us.
That's quite scary.
Yeah.
And I didn't actually know that. So this whole feminine ideal then, and how is that kind of, I suppose, linked? And what's that to do with perfectionism?
Yeah, so if you think about it, the feminine ideal, you're triggered into wanting to live up to it, right? Wanting to fit, wanting to be accepted. And perfectionism is that it's the pursuit of flawlessness as a way to stay safe. But what it really is it's a trauma response. It's it's a coping mechanism that's designed to try and create safety in situations where there wasn't psychological safety. And by trauma, I don't mean some big accident or like some big situation. It could be a number of small things. It could just be existing as a woman in this world where there's all these slightly conflicting dynamics and things that can be threatening to our safety. And so the thing that always gets me about perfectionism is we throw it around like this badge of honor, right? It's like this socially accepted flaw. Oh, I'm such a perfectionist. But actually, perfectionism is a commitment to self-judgment, is this belief that I'm not good enough as I am. I should be better. I should be perfect. And in the end, it becomes less about improvement and more about approval, where we outsource our authority again, right? Because we're so focused on other people's judgment and we spend all of our times trying to live up to what we think they want from us and lose ourselves in the process. Perfectionism isn't really about improvement, it's about approval. And we end up spending all of our energy focused on what we think other people want from us. And we lose ourselves in that process. And so because of that, it really ends up having the opposite effect of what we're trying to do. We're trying to create safety, but we end up taking it away.
So how does this end up being the opposite effect?
I think overall there are four reasons. So the first reason it's an issue and it creates trouble is that there is no such thing as perfect. And it's odd because I often end up having this conversation with clients and they come and they're like, oh, but if I could just get it right, because right is the cousin of perfect, right? If I could just get it. And I'm like, okay, what would that look like? And when you really probe, no one ever has an idea. It's this magical finish line that you think if you cross it, you'll be okay. But it's a total illusion. And so we end up chasing something that doesn't exist. And as a result, obviously, we never get there and we never get to feel good about ourselves. Which leads to the second reason, which is you then end up spending all this time in self-judgment, right? Because if you think you should be perfect and you're working towards perfect, but you never get there. And then thirdly, I think I touched upon that a little bit earlier. We outsource our authority. We take away that ability to make decisions for ourselves, to trust ourselves, to lead our own lives, because we're outsourcing that to other people and their judgments. And then fourth, we're putting on a mask, right? So if you're changing who you are and showing up in a way that isn't really authentic, then even if you get that approval that you so want, it's a little bit like cheating on a test, right? If you get the perfect score, but if you know you cheated, it's never going to feel as good. So those are all the reasons why it ends up really deteriorating our self-worth and our confidence. We're trying to create safety by fitting in and belonging and being accepted, but we're doing it on the wrong basis, and we really have to learn how to create that for ourselves first.
So, which is all really powerful stuff. And I think, the whole sense that you're putting on a mask, that you want approval and you want somebody else to tell you it's okay, or you want somebody to say, that was really good, you did really well, to make yourself feel better. But ultimately it's down to you, isn't it? It's down to you to kind of work through it. So it's like a recovery almost. So how do you go from where you might be to kind of recovering from this perfectionism?
Yeah. It's such a good question. I think I got it from somewhere. I'm not going to take credit, but I do like saying I'm a recovering perfectionist, because I definitely spend a lot of my life in this dynamic. And I think that's partly why I know how to help people now, because I've been there, like a lot of us, right?
So it's like a therapy, right?
It kind of is. I mean, I've definitely had therapy, and
Yeah.
I have a lot of time for that. I think it's important to recognize that it's a normal thing to want validation and approval, right? We're not talking about eliminating the need for validation and approval, but we're talking about eliminating the dynamic where you spend all of your time chasing that and you forget what you actually want and how you feel. So the short answer, the first answer is, cliche as it sounds, and there's a reason it's a cliche, you learn how to love yourself. You learn how to accept that you have shadow and you have light, and you look at the parts that you might want to change with compassion instead of judgment. And then I'm a huge fan of getting help. I would say that as a coach, right? But whether it's coaching or therapy, I think the value of working with a trained professional who doesn't have an agenda, who doesn't know you, who isn't involved, where you can explore all of these things, is incredibly valuable. It certainly has been to me. So that's the first part of the answer. I think it's really hard to answer this without bringing up the work of Brené Brown. I mentioned earlier, I'm a huge fan of Brené Brown. Do you know her?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. So I usually buy my clients at least one of her books, because for those who don't know her, she's a research professor who found global fame, really, talking about things like shame and vulnerability. And one of the things that she says is the way we cultivate worthiness, so the opposite of shame, right? The inherent belief that we are good enough as we are, is to cultivate and practice courage, connection, and compassion.
Okay. When you talk about being at work and how people perform, and sometimes obviously I work in HR, so there's part of the role is that performance management and how you perform versus your objectives, but also your behaviour. And a lot of people will say, oh, it's like how you put yourself out of your comfort zone. So these kind of phrases, like, what did you do differently? What did you do today that something that you wouldn't normally do?
Yeah.
And this is all part of life, isn't it? But it's all part of like people coming to work. And I'm just interested to know kind of, is there a difference between like male employees and female employees? And we did touch upon this at some point in our last conversation, that having to evidence a lot of the behaviours that are linked to being courageous outside your comfort zone. Is there any kind of research around how that's different to men and women?
Yeah, so I think if we go back to the cultural expectations of, I'm going to just stick to cisgender women in Western societies because that's kind of what we know the most about, or what I know the most about, and what we talked about, right? And then you look at the expectations of a leader traditionally. Assertive, courageous, willing to rock the boat, good with conflict, all this stuff. They're quite opposite. And that's why you get into situations where, as a female leader, you go into a performance appraisal, right? And I know this has happened to almost everyone, right? And you're always being told to be, more assertive or less aggressive or this, that, and the other. So it's known, research will tell us that 67 to 70% of performance appraisals for women contain feedback on their personality, right? So be more like this or do more. And for men, it's 1 to 2%, which I think is just a terrifying statistic. And we don't think about it, but it's because men, the leadership model that we operate within, not deliberately and not consciously, was created by men for men. And so when you're a woman, you can't really, it's like you can't win and you get stuck in this, like, do I want to be accepted as a woman? Thin, nice, modest. I know people are going to react to this, but Harvard Business Review calls it second generation bias, right? And it means it's still there, it's still present, but we just don't want to talk about it anymore because we've gotten so tired of it. But by not talking about it, we're hurting ourselves, right? Because we're sitting in this, so do I want to be accepted as a woman or do I want to be accepted as a leader? And I always have to choose. And people are always telling me that whatever I do, it's wrong because I can only fit one of the boxes, but ideally I want to fit both. So it's a real problem. You don't have to go back very far for it to not be okay for women to voice their opinions. Like, unfortunately, we're looking at thousands of years of history where women got punished, murdered for speaking up, sticking their necks out, for drawing attention to themselves. And there's a really scary experiment that I love bringing up, so I'm going to bring it up now, which is a group of researchers I think it's in Boston. I can send you the link. They tested, they had mice, right, in the laboratory, mice, and they exposed them to very mild electric shocks to their feet. But every time they did that, they put cherry blossoms in the cage, right? So the mice developed a neural pathway, a link, connection between mild pain, discomfort, and the smell of cherry blossoms. Okay? So that was the experiment. Then the mice went on to have mice babies. What are they called? This is where I don't know.
Mini mice?
Mini mice, right? So second generation mice. They put cherry blossoms in the cages. They did not administer the shocks. They had the exact same neurological response to the cherry blossoms as the original mice did to the pain. Gets worse. Those mini mice then had mini mice. I feel like it's going to be hard to take this seriously, but it's actually very serious. Same response. So you're now looking at the grandchildren of the original mice who've never seen, heard, experienced any kind of pain or discomfort. But if you put cherry blossoms in the cage, they still respond. So just consider what that means for women who have been burned at the stake and drowned and paraded through villages with, metal things across the... I mean, I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but I imagine it probably has an impact, right?
Even years and years down the line. Wow.
It's not that long ago that we didn't have the boat and we had to fight to have a voice. And here we are having this conversation. And, there's part of your brain that goes, this is profoundly unsafe. What on earth are you doing? Please stop.
And therefore, if it's unsafe, if no one really knows about it and it doesn't quite work out, I don't have to, I suppose, or we don't have to kind of acknowledge it and talk about it and maybe accept we failed, even though that was never going to happen.
Which is kind of the third dynamic that could be at play, that we call it failing in advance. When we when we're really scared that something bad's going to happen, sometimes we create it just because, again, our brains don't like uncertainty. Just basic fact, like the human brain does not like uncertainty at all. And so we make up stories and push solutions and anything to avoid uncertainty. And so if you're afraid something's going to go wrong, sometimes you can sort of model it and track it, and people end up creating the result that they're so afraid of just to avoid sitting around worrying about that it might happen.
And obviously being a leader, so if you're a manager, you're a CEO of an organisation, and you don't like that uncertainty, and you don't want to put yourself out there and throw yourself into it, is it more likely that women will be afraid of that uncertainty to men?
So I would say, based on everything that I've read and heard, it has a stronger women or minorities, right? Are likely to feel it more strongly than someone who fits perfectly into the model. They'll probably do it anyway, but I think one of the reasons you see so many women burn out is because the response is just to work harder, just to try harder, just to run faster towards that magical finish line that is there, where eventually we'll be accepted and we'll feel good. But what we ignore is that the dynamic, the context is never going to allow us to do that unless we change it.
Yeah. So it's almost more exhausting for women to be in that environment of uncertainty, feeling, I suppose, not shameful, but kind of nervous, or because you're having to use your brain more. You're having to work harder. You're having to think about how you're perceived and how you look and how you feel in order to be successful.
Yeah, women and minorities. So we know for a fact that human beings adapt for two reasons: for authority and majority, right? And that's, again, it's a safety, it's a trauma response to create safety. I want to adapt so I can fit in, so that you'll like me and protect me and keep me as part of the group. And so if you're a minority and you stand out, your natural inclination is going to be to change yourself to fit in. But what happens in the process, of course, is that you lose the uniqueness that is you, and you lose the connection to your own sovereignty and your own, you liking yourself, which is where the shame point comes in, right? Shame is the painful belief or experience that we're flawed, we're not right as we are, and so we have to hide the parts that are undesirable in order to receive love and connection and belonging.
Can you talk more about that?
Yes, I absolutely can.
Is that okay?
Yes, of course. You want to talk about shame?
Go
Let's
on,
do it.
Let's do it.
So shame it's an odd one. I would say that it's probably the most powerful human emotion that exists, which is odd because if you think about it, it's not a natural emotion. Babies don't feel shame. It's taught. It's something we learn. And I think we all feel it. I mean, unless, you're a narcissist or a sociopath, you're going to feel shame. And the instinctive response to shame is that you want to hide. Right? You can see how that works. If I think, or these sides of me are like so undesirable, I don't want to show them to Cat because then Cat's going to reject me and judge me. So I hide them. So I put on this mask. I put up this shield and I go into the world like that. And as such, you can, if we go back to perfectionism, you could say that shame really it's like the birthplace of perfectionism, right? Because shame sits there on our shoulders saying you're not good enough as you are. You're going to screw it up. You're going to get rejected. And if you're a perfectionist, you believe that already, right? Like, I should be better. I should be perfect.
Yeah.
So the two go perfectly hand in hand, which is why I think shame loves the perfectionist.
Yeah. And I talk to lots of organisations where obviously in leadership boardrooms, exec committees, they're looking for that gender balance, the diversity in the boardroom. And you talk about, obviously, if you're a minority, so women are a minority,
Yeah.
but
Often.
I can imagine if you are the only woman in the boardroom, or maybe 2 women in the boardroom, this must manifest, the whole shame and this perfectionism and these feelings must manifest even more because you're on your own. Do you talk to lots of women who are on their own? And I suppose, what advice do you give women leaders who are sitting in Execco feeling like that?
Yeah, I do. I get an awful lot of very experienced, extremely brilliant women coming to me saying, I don't know what's going on, but I seem to have lost my confidence.
They've lost their voice.
Right?
Yeah.
And typically the way they explain it is they'll paint this image. They're sitting in the meeting, or they're going into the meeting, and all these thoughts are running through their heads, right? Did I prepare enough? Do I know enough? Am I enough of an expert? And it's all of like, am I worthy enough to be here? Am I good enough to make my point? Do I have something to contribute? And so the first thing we do is we create the awareness around, okay, this is happening, right? This is very real. There's a reason you feel this way, and let's just look at what it does. And you can really play it out and see when you think those thoughts, how it directly affects your actions, right? You're not going to take strong action and show up from those thoughts. You're going to hide and hold back. So we create the awareness, and then we usually do quite a bit of talking about the context. I mean, the conversation we just had, sort of validating it and going there, there's a reason you feel this way. It's not that you're crazy. It's not that you're, you should just be more confident and you're just so insecure. It's like, it's your brain is trying to protect you. And then you have to undo that dynamic. So typically we have to start by understanding, how did it start? Where does it come from? Because it happens somewhere along the line, and it's often, you talk to women at university, they're doing much better than their male colleagues often, and they're very confident and feel very sure. But then they go into these environments, and especially if you're in these male-dominated environments, it chips away at you. But you adapt for majority and authority, and then suddenly you're losing yourself, but you haven't noticed that you're losing yourself, and then you start to feel less confident because you rejected a lot of who you are, and that's just never, that kind of thing doesn't get past your subconscious, right? It's noticing, okay, she doesn't like who she is.
What do you have male clients, and you talk to lots of businesses all the time.
Yeah.
What do you say to them, and how can they support their female leaders? And there's lots of advocates.
Yes.
And
for sure.
There are brilliant clients that I meet who really want to support the development of their female leaders. So what would you say to them?
I work with a lot of male clients, and I love working with my male clients, and I think it's not easier for men than it is for women. Right? I think in certain workplaces, if you belong to the natural majority, that part may be easier, but there's still issues around living up to a leadership model that might not fit who you are, right? And that a lot of men have been taught that they have to reject their sensitive side and repress their emotions, and so that then really becomes the work to give permission, for them to give permission to themselves to show up with more nuance. And that then in return it frees up, empathy and compassion, and it probably makes it easier to engage in the dialogue around what's needed to support women and minorities in the workplace, because you come from a place of groundedness and compassion and openness, rather than I have to live up to this very stern, hard, tough model. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And my experience is most people, by far the majority, come from a place of really good intentions, right? The best of intentions. And it's only when we don't acknowledge some of the underlying dynamics and some of the history that we get into trouble. And this is where I think men can help a lot, because I know for a lot of women, they're quite tired of bringing this up, of starting this conversation, because it doesn't always get received well. And I think one of the things that men can do is just be more mindful. Things like the performance appraisal stats, right? So I've talked to quite a lot of male CEOs about this, because I tell everyone, because I want everyone to know. And not a single one has gone, oh, it's not true, I don't do that. Actually, all of them have gone, oh my God, I never thought of that. I've totally done that. Let me course correct. Right. So it's a lot about awareness and just knowing what the problem is and what the options are.
So you're talking about like perfectionism is actually a judgment. For our listeners and people watching us today, what advice would you give if this is really resonating with them?
So the first thing I say is what not to do, which is try to change too much too quickly. Because remember, this comes from a place of trying to create safety and protection. And if you go, oh, I'm just gonna like bear all of my flaws to the whole world tomorrow, there's going to be a backlash and you're not going to have a good experience, and that's only going to prove that it's not safe for you to be your authentic self, right? So little by little is the way to do it. And if we go back to the research, the antidotes are courage, compassion, and connection. So you find the courage to look at the things that you don't see as desirable, like you just modeled for us. Thank you. Then and this is really a practice, you practice compassion. You practice going, okay, I may not love this, but it's part of who I am, and I can work on it, right? It's like the difference between, say something goes wrong, you take the train to the wrong station when you're reporting a podcast with your friend Kat, and instead of going, oh my God, I'm such an idiot, you go, okay, that wasn't great. Right? It's kind of how do you speak to yourself? And the golden rule here is, if you wouldn't say it to your best friend or to your child, don't say it to yourself. So compassion for the things that aren't great, and then connection. So if you've gone through that, if you've looked at it honestly with compassion, and you can then find an opportunity to share. Not with the whole world, not with people who haven't earned your trust, but your husband, for example, right? Someone where you have evidence that they will love you almost no matter what. And then you share it like you just did with all of us. And then hopefully what you receive is, compassion and acceptance. And that then shows you that actually it is safe and you are lovable the way you are. And it does two things. One, you communicate to yourself that you like yourself, which is really important. And you communicate to the other person, to me, to the rest of us, that you've given us permission to also be human. So I think that's the recipe. I'm a huge fan of getting help, right? I would find someone to work with, because I think these things have typically the patterns we've built up over a lifetime, and the neural networks are very strong. And so you need to work with someone who understands how to help you undo that gently and replace it with something meaningful, but in your own, in your own time, at your own pace, in a way that respects the reasons behind the behaviors, and takes into account where you want to go instead, which is kind of what we do with coaching. So, yeah.
Well, thanks for coming to our Windsor office today. I know it took a while. If people want to hear more or they want to talk to you, how do they get in touch?
Following me on LinkedIn is probably a good way to go if you want to just hear more, get more info. I do a lot of talking and writing about these topics. I'm also on Instagram. And my contact info is also on my LinkedIn page. So you can, if you want to talk more about what some of this means for you, and how to potentially go about doing some of the work, you could set up a consultation. Just email me, call me, text me, DM me, whatever. I'm always happy to hear from people. for whatever reason. So yeah,
Well, I've really enjoyed this. I want to do this again.
let's do
I
it again.
think we've probably got more to talk about.
Yeah.
And maybe we touch base in the new year. And I think people pleasing might be our next topic.
Good one, especially after the holidays when everyone's been like stuck in a house with their families.
Yeah,
Trying to get along.
absolutely.
Fun. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.